So picking up where we left off on, I want to say last Thursday's lesson, we're moving on to the next step following the Iowa caucus, right? We said Iowa comes first. It has an enormous significance in the country in terms of getting attention. And, when you win Iowa, you tend to increase your fundraising totals. And it gives you a big boost of momentum as you head into the remaining 49 primaries. And the second one kind of does that too, right? Like Iowa comes first, New Hampshire is second. The main difference here is that New Hampshire, unlike Iowa, is not a caucus state. So, we talked about caucuses and how, they're basically a 2-hour meeting where you go and you kind of say, I'm supporting this particular candidate. And then, other people argue. And at the end of the night, they count and see how many people were supporting each candidate. And that's how they award the delegates. New Hampshire, however, is a primary, which is a whole lot simpler, right? Caucuses favor older, more engaged voters, and richer because, it's 2 hours on a weekday evening, and that can be hard for people to attend. But primaries are quick, right? New Hampshire primary, you basically go in and you step into a voting machine and you push a couple buttons and you walk out and you have cast your vote in the nominating campaign. That's essentially what a primary is, right? You cast ballot for your preferred candidate, you're in, you're out, you're 10, 15 minutes, just like regular voting. And it is the very first primary, right? Because Iowa is a caucus. Now, we saw in the cartoon that we looked at last week, where the frogs were trying to leap in front, we know how important New Hampshire and Iowa are in terms of kind of getting attention and jumpstarting people's campaigns. But more than that, they're really important to those states too, because when it's the New Hampshire primary, New Hampshire gets more attention on it than it ever does. I mean, it's an itty bitty little state up in the Northeast that people practically forget is even a part of America. Iowa's a bigger state, but what do people know about Iowa? Corn in the middle of the country. But when it's their turn, they do actually get a significant amount of attention. And so a lot of states that come later realizing that, by the time you hit number 39 in the primary process, in many years, the candidate or the nominee has already been wrapped up, and that particular primary campaign is pretty much meaningless. And so a lot of states have tried to move their primaries or caucuses forward, trying to kind of jump them earlier in the nominating campaign in order to get all that media attention of Iowa and New Hampshire. This is called front loading, right? It's when states try to move their primary earlier to capitalize on the increased attention that comes with earlier primaries or caucuses. And this is the reason for this is not only about the attention, but basically a lot of states know that their primaries, especially when they're later, are basically irrelevant, right? So, two huge states actually, Texas and California, both have their primaries very late in the, excuse me, very late in the nominating calendar. And as I already said, that in most years, the leading candidate has already earned enough delegates to wrap up the nomination. And so, in Texas and California, they oftentimes find that their primaries are pretty much irrelevant, right? People don't even really show up to vote, right? Because what for, right? We already know who the candidate's going to be. So there really isn't any point. This happened to Mitt Romney in 2012 in both of those states. But the problem with this is that earlier primaries and earlier caucuses oftentimes are asking voters to cast a ballot for a candidate without really knowing how that candidate's going to stand up to a long, tried and true campaign, right? And so it is not uncommon for people to vote for somebody in Iowa and then find that, even as much as a win in Iowa jump-started a campaign and got them a lot of money. Not everyone that wins Iowa becomes the presidential nominee. And so, sometimes you see people vote for somebody in Iowa, they're like, this person's going to be great. And then that person is out of the race within 3 weeks. So now let's take a look at this idea. So, let's say you won a primary or you won a caucus. What happens next, right? And this is a picture of the nominees or the people running for the nomination back in 2016. Obviously, we know who got it, right? It's this guy right here, and ultimately her. Um, but basically, as I already said, that when you are as a candidate trying to earn the nomination of a major party, when you win a caucus or a primary, you earn party delegates, right? According to how many are available in that state, Democrats award their delegates proportionally, right? So if you win 55% of the vote in New Hampshire, you get 55% of New Hampshire's delegates. If you win 25% of New Hampshire's vote, you get 25% of New Hampshire's delegates. Pretty simple, but Democrats do proportional, whereas Republicans kind of have a mix where some of their states are proportional, but some are winner take all, meaning, you can get one more vote in, New Hampshire than the second place guy, and you get all of New Hampshire's delegates, and that other person gets none. Now, as I already said, this gives candidates momentum and increases fundraising campaigns, but also, losses in early primary or caucuses can actually doom a campaign, right? A lot of, big campaigns will typically try and run to something called Super Tuesday, which is about a month in, and it's when like 12 states have their primaries all on the same day. And so a lot of like well-funded campaigns will try to get to Super Tuesday, but if they haven't won or really finished all that high in any of the campaigns or the primaries rather up until that point, that's usually it for them. They die out because once you start losing repeatedly, your ability to raise money basically goes away, right? Because it's really hard to call somebody up on the phone and say, hey, I'm running for president. I really need your support. Would you like to make a donation? And they say, wait, no, like you haven't won anything in ever. And so if I give you money, like there's a good chance you're going to be out of the race next week. I'd rather give it to somebody who I believe might have a chance. So let's dive a little deeper in this situation and kind of examine what are the problems with the way that we currently do the primary and caucuses in the presidential nominating campaign. Number one, as we've already just discussed, early caucuses and primaries get a huge amount of attention. And it just so happens that a lot of our early states tend to be relatively unimportant. They're not battleground states, right? So the states that decided the election, right, this time were Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Arizona and Nevada and Georgia, and none of those primaries are early. And so, what is sort of having a huge influence on who ultimately gets the nominee? It's these smaller, less important states like New Hampshire, and third is South Carolina, which is always interesting to me because the Democrats don't have a prayer of winning South Carolina anytime super soon, unless Stacey Abrams, gets in there and does her thing that she did in Georgia. But that's neither here nor there. And so the next problem, in addition to causing candidates to put a lot of attention on early states, the next problem is that if you are currently in office, if you are currently president, or if you are currently a senator, or you're currently a U.S. House member and you're running for a Senate seat, or you're currently a senator and running for the president, it can be really hard for politicians to take time away to do all the campaigning that goes into a long drawn out primary and caucus season, right? That primary and caucus season is easily 6 months. It was shortened because of COVID this last year, but basically, if you're in a 6-month nominating campaign, that's 6 months you're on the road giving speeches and kissing babies and having beers at random bars with like voters in their districts. And so if you are in charge of running a state as a governor, or if you're, a senator, it can be really hard to balance those things and do all the campaigning while also doing your job. The third big complaint here is that in this long primary and caucus season, money plays too big a role in nominating, right? And because basically you either win, one of the first 5 states, or get, second place finishes, or, maybe you have strong efforts and nobody, predicted, or you start building momentum. But really, it's, success in early states um, is going to be the determining factor of whether your campaign can continue. Unsuccessful campaigns early run out of gas and they just basically disband. And then successful states get more money. The next thing goes back to what we saw in that cartoon of the 3 old people doing the WrestleMania play, and it said Caucus Mania, right? Is that the primary and caucus realities are very problematic, and we saw this in the general election that we just saw this last Tuesday. Is that because the voter participation in these caucuses and primaries are generally much, much smaller than the general election, it tends to not be representative of what the general election is. So, we're going to look at this in the coming weeks, but it very much seems to me that Joe Biden won the presidency based off of basically doing a little bit better in the suburbs than maybe the Democrats have traditionally. So doing well in suburbs and then doing very well in major cities with voters of color. Now the thing is none of those, well, especially the voters of color in cities, those people aren't usually who show up and dominate primaries or caucuses. Primaries and caucuses are very, very invested party members, oftentimes older, who have the time, but they're the true believers. And so what this is a huge problem, because in order to win, some hardcore Democrats, or in order to win a nominating campaign with hardcore Republicans, you basically have to pander towards the people that show up for the primaries. These are your true believers. If you're a Democrat, tends to be very, very, very liberal voters dominate the nominating campaign, right? And for the conservative, or for Republicans, very, very conservatives tend to dominate the caucuses and the primaries of the nominating campaign. So what candidates tend to do, if you could see my fingers here, I'm showing this, but basically you're going to have to envision, basically if you think of like a number line, candidates have to run to the edges, right? So, if you're a Republican, you have to run to the right and go as far right as you can in order to win with your very conservative primary and caucus voters. If you're a Democrat, you're running all the way to the left and making it seem like you're super liberal in order to appeal to the very liberal people that tend to show up for caucuses and primaries. And so once you finish and you actually, let's say get the nomination, then oftentimes the candidates will try really hard to run back to the center, because the center is historically what does better in a general election, right? Which is made up of not just, the party faithful or the party, serious liberals or conservatives, but just, normal everyday Americans. And so that like run to the fringes and then race back to the center in time for election day is tricky. This system also gives a lot of power to the media, right? And in many ways, we talked about the, party officials and party members um, being kingmakers throughout most of our early part of our country's history, because these party bosses would basically choose who was going to be the Democrats or the Republicans nominee for president. And we said, well, that ended after Watergate and Vietnam caused reform in the nomination campaigns. But what has replaced these kingmakers is, you could argue that the press, that the media has replaced. And so, what has been promoted to replace this primary and caucus reality, which is long and problematic, would be a national primary, where basically all 50 states have their primaries on the same day. No state gets more attention than others. I'm going to wrap up here. We're actually just going to do one episode here today. You're welcome.